Welcome. Hi, I'm Professor Lord, and I'm a law professor, which is why I don't usually use PowerPoints. And in this presentation, we'll go over a paper I recently published in a United States law journal, which is about Scientology. And it's about how Scientology has been able to use the power of expertise, scholarly external expertise, and use that to try to gain whatever consequences exist within the legal system. We'll talk about that generally, right? We'll talk about why religions want to have certain statuses in law, whether that's by virtue of the Constitution and by virtue of a bunch of other laws that gives religions certain privileges. And then we'll discuss how that's done. And we see that very acutely in the case of Scientology because it's a new religious movement. So most religions have been around for a long time, right? And the question doesn't really arise as to whether or not they deserve certain statuses in law. And some people might disagree with, right, the beliefs of a particular religion, but they don't generally disagree that they are religions. And that's very different for Scientology, arguably also for any other relatively new religion. But there hasn't really been one, at least in the past, say, 100 years, that's been as successful in gaining certain statuses and privileges in law as Scientology has been. So I think for that reason, it's a particularly interesting case study for us to consider these issues. We'll talk about how Scientology, as I said, right, has harnessed the power of external scholarly expertise to gain certain statuses in law, how that differs from its earlier strategy when it initially lost and then regained tax-exempt status in the United States. And we'll see how that evolution of a strategy over time, I think, illustrates some very interesting issues as to, right, how religions can gain tax-exempt status, how they can gain legitimacy in law, which they can then use for their own purposes, right, for the purposes of having their own internal systems of rules, which then, right, they can use to apply certain discipline measures, say, to their members. And that, ultimately, as we'll see, is about something even broader, right? It's about the interplay of these systems of rules, which are essentially about law, right? The law is about rules, generally rules that we consider to be mandatory in some way, because there's a consequence to them, and there are non-state legal systems, right? Systems of rules that affect the lives of members that are not laid down by the government. And certainly there are of these, right, religious legal systems, which are set out in religious doctrine and applied by religions. And ultimately what we'll discuss today is about how these different systems of rules and governance mechanisms interact, how they clash, what the legal system requires for other systems of rules to exist, and ultimately how it ensures that these system of rules can somehow coexist, which is also ultimately about how people can manage to coexist when they have very different views and when they consider that their religious views are very important to finding happiness and being able to somehow, right, live a happy and fulfilling life in society. I should note from the onset that it builds significantly upon the work of Professor Stephen Kent. You'll recall who's a longstanding, illustrious member of ICSA, of course, and you might recall I presented a paper last year which was about Scientology's legal system, about what system of rule it has, right, how it exists, why that's important. And that more specific work that we'll discuss today is very much inspired by Professor Kent, who's done lots of the underlying work in looking at an organization called Cessner, which many of you may dislike very strongly, certainly know about. And he's been a pioneer, as he's been in other areas regarding Scientology in I wouldn't say exposing, but laying out the ways in which, right, they've been able to produce expertise, scholarly expertise that appears to be external, but that can be used for self-serving aims, as was the case specifically with Scientology. So, first, right, there are, as I said, religious legal systems. Not to go over my presentation from last year, which you can find on the internet. I'll try to link it somewhere, have a slide at the end of this so that you have the link. But essentially, Scientology is very unique religion, even among other religions, like, say, Christianity or Islam. Very unique in that it has a very, very thorough and all-encompassing system of rules. So all the books you see behind me, right, or Scientology doctrine, that's a lot of stuff for someone to write over their lifetime. And it encompasses a lot of a member's life, which is unusual, right? Oftentimes, religious legal systems will be more discrete. They'll be more specific to specific areas of a member's life. And it also has certain mechanisms to apply these rules, as we'll see, called the Committee of Evidence, which is not unusual, right? You have to have a way for rules to be applied. But as I said last year, Scientology is very unusual in that it has, and that's the subject of a panel at this conference by Professor Kant, me, and Chris Shelton, which will be, I think, after this presentation, which is the Rehabilitation Project Force. Scientology had, or has, not clear, but certainly for a long time it did, a punishment facility where members were punished, and that is very unusual. Usually, legal systems within religions will have rules and enforcement mechanisms. But the usual punishment, so to speak, is that you get kicked out of the religion, right? It's excommunication, which is different from the regular, quote unquote, we'll call it the mainstream legal system from now on. Different from the mainstream legal system, which does something different, right? Can take away people's money and can also take away their freedom, put them in jail. That's the two things the usual legal system does, and it can force that, right? So if you lose, the government somehow will find a way, right, to execute that decision. It will put you in jail even if you disagree, and whoever wins will be able to take your money by force if you disagree, right? Of course, religious legal systems cannot do that. They can't, at least directly, take your money or your freedom away. And usually what they can do is kick you out of the religion. As you can imagine, right, first, this is something that can have a very, very significant impact on a person's life. Certainly they care a lot about their faith, right? That's why we protect all these things in developed countries. And so people will often be very, very afraid of being kicked out of the religion, and for that reason, it does induce compliance. In fact, might induce compliance with rules in a way that's more stringent or significant than what you see in the regular mainstream legal system. However, as I said, right, it doesn't have the power to do these things by force. Scientology is unique in that it did, right? It did not only excommunicate people, it had physical punishment, which was somehow voluntary, but for reasons that we'll look at in a bit more detail in the panel I just mentioned at this conference, it doesn't work that way, right? You can't consent to physical punishment. So it counts as a crime, as we'll see, it's something that you cannot derogate from, right? So it's not something that, like other things, religion get to do because they're religions. And it's not something that you can subject yourself to voluntarily. So there's no such thing as, right, being punched when you agree to it. It still counts as assault because you cannot agree to it. And essentially, some form of punishment that has, right, a corporal or labor component to it, right, if it's imposed, is essentially the same thing as assault, to oversimplify things a little bit. So Scientology had that, and it's unusual in that way, and we'll see later on why that might be. Even though it's blatantly illegal, right, Scientology's been able to do that essentially because of the lack of intervention of the regular legal system in that. Another thing that's discussed in my presentation, which we won't get into, are arbitration clauses. So Scientology has certain contracts it signs with its members, and which it uses to broaden the scope of that legal system. So things that it otherwise couldn't do, right? Not the criminal stuff I just mentioned, because that's not allowed, but other things, right? Disputes that otherwise would not be subject to that legal system. That is broadened in scope and therefore subject to Scientology's legal system because it gets its member to sign an arbitration agreement. And arbitration is essentially a consensual mechanism, which you have in a bunch of other areas of the law, right? Of course, you can say it's not consensual if you force people to sign the contract, which is true. But generally, if they sign the contract, they consent to something, right, which is arbitration, which is they forego their right, which they otherwise have a right to by virtue of the Constitution, to go to court. Instead, they go to some other place, which can be religious, and they submit themselves to the decision of that decision maker. And because both people have that right, I just mentioned, to go to court, right, you have to have both parties agree. So you see already, before we get into the specifics, that Scientology has, right, first, some independence by virtue of what the legal system grants it, like any other religion that meets the tests that we'll see in more detail shortly. And you see that Scientology has been somehow, right, somewhat strategical in broadening that, in doing things that otherwise other organizations don't get to do, right, or cannot do. And by using things like physical punishment, like arbitration clauses, been able to broaden that independence beyond what other religious organizations have, and as a consequence of that, has made its legal system, right, its internal system of rules, more significant than other religions, and ultimately that, right, displaces the usual legal system some more than it would in the case of any other religion. So what are these consequences that we just mentioned, right? Why do religions want to get certain privileges? And the answer is there are a lot, and they are very significant. You have two sets. You have some that are attributed by virtue of the Constitution. That will be true in most developed countries, certainly true in the United States, Canada. The Constitution affords religion certain constitutional protections, and these protections are afforded inherently. So you get them when you count as a religion on the basis of a test that's usually very, very easy to meet. And that's because we care about religion, right? We think it's important. We think that people can't really be happy, fulfilled, or live their life fully in a developed country if they don't get an opportunity to live in accordance with their faith. And that's why we protect that. That's why we protect it even when we think it's wrong, misguided, bad for the person, right? We think it's so important to protect it. It's worth these consequences. And so, as I stand for that reason, these protections attach inherently. So, doesn't matter that you're a bad religion, right? You're protected as soon as you establish some sort of religious belief. And oftentimes you'll also be protected for the absence of a religious belief, right? So say you're an atheist and the government tries to force you to say you like Jesus. That would also be prohibited, and it would be a violation of your freedom of religion, even though your religion is no religion. So very broad, all-encompassing in terms of constitutional protection, and that has attaches by virtue of a very low standard, has still very, very significant consequences. Some of them are individual, so the government won't be able to decide how you worship, whether that's in a somewhat public place like a park, or whether that's right in your home. Won't be able to force you to say something that's against your faith. And it also has a group component to it. And that group component to it manifests itself by government non-intervention, essentially. So you'll have a religious group like Scientology. They'll come up with the stuff there, right, with the rules. And then these rules, right, will be applied internally, and it might be that these rules are completely different from those of the mainstream legal system. So, for example, right, you have a right to get your money back, a refund, right? Well, Scientology policy might say you don't, when you do by virtue of the law. That's just one example. So, you see that, right, if the government doesn't intervene, the religion's able to essentially apply a system of rules that's inconsistent with the regular legal system. And, right, the religion is therefore able to supplant or to displace the mainstream legal system, at least to that extent. And the government, right, essentially the rationale by virtue of the Constitution will say, we cannot review what is essentially religious doctrine. So magically now the refund policy I mentioned, right, which does exist in Scientology, right, the refund policy is religious. It's a religious rule, and therefore the government doesn't get to see whether that rule was applied properly because it's fundamentally different from a rule in the usual legal system. And therefore, right, the courts can't review that, and therefore the religious legal system exists. Then you have a bunch of other consequences, which I mentioned in the paper, which are by virtue of other laws. So oftentimes having to do with labor laws, right? So overtime pay or pay, right? Not paying people at all, for example, that might be allowed by certain labor laws for religious organizations. It's not something you have a right to do normally. Same thing for taxation consequences. So not paying taxes, which can be very significant, right? Especially for a religion like Scientology, which is relatively new. If somehow it can get away from paying taxes and its members can write off on their taxes what they give, that is a very significant benefit in ensuring the survival of the organization, as you can imagine. These consequences, in contrast to the constitutional protections I just mentioned, are not inherent. They are essentially privileges, not rights, and therefore you have to deserve them. And then you'll have to meet certain tests, right, by virtue of the law. And if you don't meet these tests, which often will disqualify you if you're a bad religion, right? If you're a religion that the government thinks is abusive or is financially mismanaged, then you won't get these very significant benefits. Regardless, though, you see, right, even for just constitutional protections, how important it is for a religious organization to gain that, especially a religious organization like Scientology that is trying to establish its legitimacy. And it will have echoes of broader legitimacy, of course, right, in establishing in society generally the legitimacy of a belief system. But it will also have very tangible consequences, right? Financial consequences, for example, that will help ensure the survival of a religious organization. So, Scientology, as you see in the paper, has been very aware of that. And that's arguably why it's been, as I mentioned earlier, one of the only organizations that's been able, if not the only organization, that's been able to gain, right, as much legal status as recently, right? There are other new religions like, say, Jehovah's Witnesses, but they're over 100 years older than Scientology is. So very unusual. The tests for both of the sets of consequences I just mentioned involve experts, right? So that's how the court system works. It's one of the reasons why it's very expensive. We won't get into that, right? But essentially, things become true if some expert who's supposed to be objective, even though you're paying them, says so. And so Scientology has been very acutely aware, right, both of the importance of gaining certain statuses in law, which we just mentioned, and of the ways in which experts are important to being able to gain that. And they've adopted strategies, as we'll see, and this is discussed in a lot more detail in the paper, that have varied over time. So first you had Scientology, as I mentioned earlier, right, does have tax-exempt status in the United States. That's been the subject of a lot of discussion lately, but it does have tax-exempt status, right? There's a lot of discussion as to how it got that tax-exempt status in the 80s by essentially intimidating government agents, which is true, right? Certainly one of the only organizations that could intimidate successfully a tax agency. But that was not the first time Scientology had tax-exempt status. It had it before, and then because of financial mismanagement, lost it. And so it wanted to regain it. And it had two varying strategies then and today, as we'll see, and as is discussed in the paper. then it sought to suppress the experts that it disagreed with. So again, recognizing, right, that it's important to gain status. So at the time, right, it was very important to regain tax-exempt status. Essentially, Scientology, when they lost their tax-exempt status, decided that they still wouldn't pay taxes because they thought the decision was wrong. And so the taxes kept accruing, and Scientology would essentially have gone bankrupt if it had to pay all of these accrued taxes. As you can imagine, it was a very significant issue for Scientology to survive at the time. And the way in which it went about regaining tax-exempt status was to essentially suppress the experts that disagreed with it. So it had certain experts which said Scientology didn't meet the tests, right? Scientology shouldn't qualify as a religion. And it sought to suppress these experts by attacking them. There's a lot of detail in the paper, very aggressively, very personally, right? Of course, when Scientology posts, say, a press release, it certainly doesn't have the same impact today. Even at the time, right, it didn't have the same impact on, say, a professor, right, because Scientology is not particularly qualified to give an opinion as to a professor, but it's intimidated them, right, in the way that we know Scientology has, right? It's framed people for crimes. Today, it's not as aggressive, but private investigators trying to attack people personally, trying to suggest that they've committed various illegal acts, right? All these things are ways for Scientology to indirectly, right, avoid certain experts' opinions. So it's done that both directly and indirectly, attacking the expertise of experts that disagreed with it, and indirectly trying to intimidate them by all of these tactics. And in doing that, it's been able to, right, try to suggest that there's some sort of a consensus as to the fact that it's a religion, right? Trying to get rid of all the people who disagree and then saying everyone agrees we're religion, we are legitimate. And Scientology eventually gained tax-exempt status, right? So got the sense that that strategy was effective. Today there's been, as we'll see, renewed criticism of Scientology with the Leah Remini TV show, among other things, which has brought Scientology to the attention of a very broad segment of the public who otherwise didn't know or didn't care, right? Scientology is not a particularly big religion, not particularly important anymore, so lots of people who didn't know, didn't care, turned out to become interested in Scientology, and that renewed criticism for Scientology to lose its tax-exempt status because of its current actual behavior, right? Like the private investigators, like attacking former members, the way it treats its current clergy members, we call it the Sea Org. All these things have justified certain attacks on Scientology's current tax-exempt status, and had people suggest that it should lose its tax-exempt status. And as we saw, tax exemption is a privilege, not like the constitutional stuff. So it can be taken away because you have to meet a specific and stringent legal test, and therefore you don't meet it if you are financially mismanaged, and you can also lose it because of certain, right, religious or organizational behavior issues that I've just mentioned. And Scientology has been able to answer these attacks effectively, at least so far, but has done that very differently, in a way that I think is more mature and sophisticated, and as I detail quite a bit in the paper. Instead of just attacking experts and just attacking people generally, which has a limited impact now that so many people are criticizing Scientology, right? As you can imagine, you can't intimidate an infinite or growing number of people. At some point, it just costs too much money, regardless of how much you have, right? And Scientology's been trying to do that more positively in terms of cultivating expertise, right? Trying to get more people to agree with it, to say that it's a religion and a good religion, and to kind of flood the market, quite literally, with positive academic, scholarly expertise, articles, right? Academic stuff, and therefore cultivate this idea that it is a legitimate religion. right, by having more positive experts agree with it. And it's done that, I think, by it's somewhat obscure relationship with the organization we call Cessner. Of course, right, I can't prove it. No one can, namely because we don't know where the money comes from, right? We know Scientology has money, but we don't know where Cessner gets his money. So I can't prove it, but certainly you can speculate that there are somewhat limited reasons for people to support Scientology. Or to support certain religious groups, right? For example, what I do, right? I am a law professor. The government pays me a pretty significant amount of money to do whatever I want 2 days a week and write papers on things that I find interesting, right? That's why I do it, right? And I would not do it if I did not get paid. Certainly I wouldn't do it as much or as often if I didn't get paid. As you can imagine, if you are not a professor, there are serious questions as to why you would spend 100 hours of your time writing an article, probably more than that, actually. And so, arguably, unless people are really, really convinced of something, right, and are so convinced that they're willing to volunteer a significant portion of their life consistently, you can ask where the funding comes from. And that's especially true when you have, right, within Cessner, basically no one who's a full-time academic, with some very limited exceptions, and there are legitimate questions to be asked as to, right, the motives of these people and the funding that they have to do that. And what we've seen over the past couple of years is Cessner, first they created their own journal, which really helped, right, because they were having trouble publishing their stuff elsewhere. Again, that being solely my personal opinion, and started a journal. Had their own peer reviewers, which were generally people that seemed to agree with them, and were able, by virtue of that, to start flooding the market, right? To create a very significant number of articles. I think there's one person that's mentioned in my article who wrote about 30 articles, which is a lot, right? Good law professors write 2 a year. So 30 is a lot, especially when you're supposed to have a full-time job. And the quality or the sophistication or analytical depth of these contributions has been, I think, rightfully questioned. Nonetheless, the result is the same, right? Scientology, through that, has been able to flood the market to say, right, look, there used to be 2 or 3 weird people in Canada who disagreed with us. And now there are, right, tens and tens of articles which say very positive things about us. And therefore, right, it's been able to tell the governments and courts and whoever has the big decision-making power to afford all these serious consequences, to tell them, right, we are a legitimate religion. The consensus is correct, right? There are some weird people trying to take our tax exemption away, but the people who know about this stuff all agree, right? Or the vast majority, overwhelming majority of them agree. And so, right, we do legitimately have tax-exempt status and should therefore be able to keep it. And that strategy is different, right? It's certainly more mature than just attacking experts, more likely to be effective. And I think it raises or exposes very salient issues as to how the system works, right? Because the system probably was not intended for a religious organization that knows it so well and is willing and able to take advantage of whatever opportunities there are. For example, to, as we discussed, try to exploit positive scholarly expertise to ultimately get benefits, right? At the end of the day, Scientology doesn't think that the regular legal system is legitimate, that it should have the power that it has. Scientology just uses it to get the independence that we discussed, which is very significant, to ultimately do, right, whatever it wants, which is the consequence of having these statuses. And all that ultimately, right, is about the ways in which we get people to coexist, right? That's what the legal system generally is all about, right? We make rules so that we're not worried when we go out on the street that we'll get assaulted, and that helps us do other things, right, that are more advanced, like work or think about important problems in society. And people, right, in their personal lives are driven in their behavior by rules of behavior, right, laws that are not legal, right? They're driven by their faith. They're driven by the fact that they don't want to disappoint their families. And they are driven by, right, religious rules. They're driven by their religion and the rules that are laid out in their religion. And ultimately, all these statuses we talked about are about, right, necessity. That's what essentially they were about in the first place, right? People wouldn't stay in a developed country if they couldn't somehow practice their religion. And as time evolved, they were about coexistence, about how we reconciled systems of rules within religions that are different from and inconsistent with the usual legal system. How the law mediates that disagreement, lays certain rules so that both systems, even if they're inconsistent, can coexist, which ultimately is about, right, how they can coexist in the life of a person whose behavior is also driven by, right, different systems of rules. And all that ultimately is about, right, how people get to coexist. Get to coexist when they disagree fundamentally on certain things, including the rules that should guide their behavior. And ultimately, right, we have to ask ourselves, which of these consequences are we willing to live with? Because it's not a thing that is unchangeable or inherent, right? It's decisions we make as a society. How far we're willing to go, how much we're willing to tolerate. What a religion can do, right? It can do stuff, that's for sure. But how much it can do in ways that are inconsistent with the regular legal system. And certainly, whatever your opinion is on that, I think Scientology and the way it's been able to use the system, right, to actively try to gain these statuses by looking at the criteria and trying to exploit whatever it could to meet them, raises questions as to, right, whether we're still willing to go this far or not. And I will leave you on that.